So we're going to have many different sections on this panel. To give you an overview, I will briefly introduce the subject of the AI Act. I'm told this might be of interest to some of you. Then I'm going to ask you to vote on something. We're going to have a discussion with my two guests over here in two parts, some Q&A, another vote, and then I have some surprise questions that are a real surprise, you'll see. Before I start, on my left, we have Nicolas Petit, who is a professor of competition law, among other things, at the EUI, European University Institute in Firenze, in Italy. And on my right, we have, I have to pronounce it the French way, I'm sorry, Jean-Marc Leclerc, who is the head of EU policy at IBM. All right, I'll be quick, but I had actually planned to talk about the different layers when it comes to generative AI, but luckily now I don't have to do that. The thing I want to do is to go through what we see in the space when it comes to enforcement actions, knowing that there are very little actions, which is very convenient for scholars such as Nicolas and I, and also, I suppose, to general counsels and head of policy. And then I want to talk to you about the regulations that are coming and insist a tiny bit on the AI Act. When it comes to enforcement actions in the space of generative AI, so again, looking at the four stacks, we have now the French Competition Agency who last week, today is Tuesday, so last week announced investigations against NVIDIA. We also have the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, who is showing interest in the space. They published a blog post, I think in June or July of this year, and they are now running a series of interviews, especially when it comes to the use of generative AI and IP related fields. The CMA, the Competition Market Authority in the UK, published a report, very informative, maybe 2 weeks ago now. And as I'm sure you're very much aware, there are all of those IP cases against OpenAI, Anthropic, and other companies in the United States. Now, when it comes to the regulation, as we talk right now, today is October 3rd, 2023. We know we have the AI Act coming our way, but it is still a draft. I want to make that very clear. Same, by the way, for the Data Act that I mentioned earlier. So, unfortunately, I cannot give you a timeline as to when the AI Act will be adopted. What I hear, but maybe you have more information than I do, is that in all likelihood, the AI Act will be adopted before we change the EU Parliament, so in a couple of months. Now, on that note, what I want you to do now is to vote on that question over here, and for you to do that, you have two options. The question is the following, and I know this might be an unfair question to some of you, but then I explain what you have to answer. This is a good way for people to vote. The question is the following: is, all things considered, the AI Act a good piece of regulation? I'm going to ask you the very same question toward the end of this panel to see how we may or not influence what you think about that. And if you haven't read the AI Act or heard about the discussion in the Parliament, you could just say no. Trust me on that. Now, here's the plan for the discussion. The discussion will look a little bit like this. In part one of the discussion, we're going to focus on the entire world. We thought this was the great scope for the discussion. And then slowly we move to Europe, and then we'll finish the discussion with the AI Act, right? So we're going to try to be as concrete as possible. Now, what I can promise you is that I'm going to squeeze those two gentlemen to the most that I can, and toward the end, something I'm sure fantastic will come out of the process. Oh. That's a big statement, but I'm sure you can deliver on that. All right. Now, part one of the discussion, again, is about the look at the world. I've asked them to keep their answers under 2 minutes. I know it's short, but I have quite a few questions for them. And again, I want to keep it dynamic. I'll start with you, Nicolas. The first question is this. Could you please give us an overview? What is the global competitive state when it comes to AI, looking at Europe, the United States, China? Again, you have 2 minutes. And I know you can do it.
Merci, Thibault. Okay, so, all right, so the anecdotal evidence that we have on the state of affairs in terms of competition in AI is very murky. So we have 2 new big names that came out. These are NVIDIA and OpenAI. We have 5 big names which sort of run the attention cycle. These are OpenAI, Hugging Face, Google, Meta, and who am I missing? Anthropic. The focus of the discussion seems to be a lot on consumer-facing applications like chatbots and to some extent some enterprise software, productivity application. GPT has become a suffix, a little bit like Google became a verb, which is a very strong indication that your brand is getting a lot of traction and your position seems to be involving some degree of control. And also there's a lot of FOMO, I think Anglo-American people say, fear of missing out. So you see companies like Amazon, injecting $4 billion just like this in Anthropic, following up on Microsoft's move. So there's a lot of M&A, VC, and CVC activity. Now, if you want to have a structured discussion about this industry, I think the one way to think about this has to be something like, are we going to see generative AI follow the same monopolizing tendencies as other technological discontinuities in the history of the computer industry, right? So if you think about the OS, the browser, the search engine, social networks, and all sort of coalesce towards a very concentrated market structure. And then you have a lot of sub-questions that come, like, are there winner-takes-all effects in these markets? Are there first-mover advantages? Are there incumbency advantages or incumbency liability? And I think the 3 questions allow a more structured discussion about, okay, what's going on? Now, some agencies, as Thibault was saying, seem to have a fairly strong intuition about the monopolistic tendencies of these industries, but it's not a fatality that every business located in the computer industry has to end up in a monopoly. I mean, you can take search, which is very concentrated, but you can think of mobile OS, which has a very stable duopoly, or you can think of the cloud markets, which are subject to sort of strong oligopoly tendencies with product differentiation. So I think it's too early to tell, but I think this is the right analytical framework to think about this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So you've mentioned indeed the craze we see in the space. I have some numbers. We all like numbers. 2018, in the space of AI, generally speaking, $400 million USD were invested by venture capitalists. In 2022, 4.5 billion. And I've read this morning in Les Echos, another French name, that as I speak, it's already past 19 billion, right? So we know from experience that competition agencies will be interested when you see such a flow, which leads to immediately enforcement action and regulation. And again, looking at, a map of the entire world, I will then ask you the question as to what are the tendencies. So I'm not asking you to give a precise overview of all the regulations we see in the space, but what is the mindset and the philosophy between all the regions in the world when it comes to regulative AI and generative AI?
Yeah, thanks, Thibault. Yeah, it can be a bit confusing because there are really different approaches. And, to be honest, there are serious initiatives and there's a bit of political positioning, because this is a very hot topic. Every policymaker wants to be seen doing something about AI here or there. So, sometimes you have to try and make a difference between the positioning and the serious initiative. Of course, you have the traditional regulatory intervention. We'll talk more about the AI Act later. And by the way, everybody's thinking, okay, the AI Act, but there are already pieces of legislation that already regulate AI in Europe. And there are other pieces of legislation which are draft status, which also regulate AI. The Product Liability Directive, for example, talks about high-risk AI as well. You have a directive on AI liability in Europe, which is on pause at the moment, but it's a very important piece. Anyway, if you compare, for example, several main regions of the world, you take maybe let's look at China and the US, for example. You have some significant pieces of legislation in China. In very recent years, at least three pieces of legislation which are about the hot stuff that Nicolas was mentioning. Generative AI, AI that makes recommendations, and they go quite far. People are focused on the AI Act, but in these pieces of Chinese legislation, okay, you can say that a lot of it is about information control, okay, but you have some rules that go further than the EU AI Act on recommendations, on even on bias mitigation, on databases where you have to put all your systems in the databases, etc., self-assessments, etc. So it goes quite far in China. The US is a bit more messy. Everybody's focused on the federal level because there's a lot of agitation, right? At the moment, you have commitments by companies, good commitments. You will have an executive order probably this month in October from the White House, and you have various senators that are in the spotlight at the moment with their own proposals for legislative bills. Federal level, a lot of agitation, but nobody's looking, at least outside of the US, at the state level. I haven't looked at that since before the summer, but last time I checked, there were 14 or 15 pieces of legislation at state level in the US. Some of them go very far, and when I say very far, I mean imposing very detailed, specific rules on providers or users of AI systems. A lot of them have to do with auditing, for example, or AI in the workplace, but they can go quite far. So, and then you have other countries. We'll talk about other initiatives, but in Japan, for example, you have a completely different approach. In many countries in Southeast Asia, you have approaches that are more about, okay, let's have some general principles, and then do everything we can as a government to push innovation by other means than legislation. So it's a complex world on AI policy at the moment, but you do have these two legs of countries that legislate, regulate, including regulating what I consider to be hype. We'll talk about that later. And you have other countries that are more about supporting their own companies and making and having a proper AI market at national level.
So I'm sure what you just explained will actually please some people in the room, meaning here the lawyers, right? Because when you have a complex world, when it comes to regulation, this is where we can actually provide some value, and will surely displease some engineer and data scientist. But to make it even more complex, and I will then again go to you, Jean-Marc, could you please tell us now not what's happening at the level of each individual country, but looking at more international cooperative efforts, looking at the OECD, the G7, what's happening here in the space?
Equally confusing because there's so much going on.
Yes.
Okay, the really trendy one at the moment is the Hiroshima process, G7 process, very much led by Japan. Again, we'll hear more this month because the idea is to have two things: general principles around AI development and use, and to go with that, some commitments, a code of conduct, if you like, by companies. The G7 is going to consult at the Internet Forum, I think next week, and then in November there should be something a bit more practical that we can, or real text that we can look at. So that's the hot one, the G7. I'm sure you've heard about the safety summit in the UK. I mean, the British government's definitely made a lot of noise around that one. A guest list of 100 guests will discuss not about AI that we see in the marketplace at the moment, but it's a bit of a futuristic approach. We're talking about systems that could cause enormous damage, huge risks. So it's a bit of a crystal ball type of conversation they will have. But every company that matters, every government that has an opinion on AI should be there. That's in November. The UN's talking about AI. I hear we're going to have a new working group also in, I think, October, or maybe before the end of the year, on AI. The Council of Europe, not well known, but there's a lot of work for the past over a year, 2 years maybe, on a convention on AI, and you know, the Council of Europe is much bigger than the EU in terms of membership. So that's one to look at as well. You mentioned the OECD. The OECD is doing a lot around AI, but I think the one area that people know more is the work that the OECD does on taxonomy and definitions. You see that conversation everywhere in the world. What is an AI system? Nobody knows exactly how to define that precisely. But the OECD is playing a leading role in that. They're reviewing their definition at the moment, and everybody's waiting for the final definition. It's very important. Between the EU and the US, lots of discussion. You have this Trade and Technology Council that also works on taxonomy, but other things, standardization, very important elements. But you know, I think many of these initiatives might converge. I think under the G7 Hiroshima process, because that's really a very serious initiative. But yeah, it's a lot going on.
Yeah. So now, each of those countries and/or international forum will face, at the very least, 2 issues that I know you are keen on exploring. And I'm going to ask you to give us a sense of what this could be and how maybe to overcome that if possible. Nicolas, I know you are, and you actually wrote that when you were part of the AI expert group for the European Commission. You wrote a blog post that I really encourage you to read on the lemons problem. Jean-Marc, I know then you want to talk about regulatory moats. So first, you Nicolas, how those countries can actually overcome. So first, what is the lemons problem and how to overcome the problem if possible?
Hey, can I do something very French? That is not answer your question, but talk about something that Jean-Marc talked about?
Sure, but you only have 2 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, no, so, and then I'll talk about the lemons, no problem. So one thing that I wanted to mention here is, and I realized this when I heard Jean-Marc talking about the very diversified set of approaches that we are witnessing worldwide is, you know, so the EU has done this thing, it has seen AI and it said, okay, let's have an AI Act, right? And the AI Act is all about market access. So it's all about making sure that AI products, you know, started in France, can start in France and then, you know, roam around the EU in a single market. But when you think about it, you know, I think it's a bit like the EU has this fascination for the new stuff every time. So you have the AI Act and you have the CEP regulation and you have, but never really seems to question, you know, how it could work towards a single market for real. And when you realize that the economics of AI systems are based on cash flow intensive technological scaling and development, what really matters for Europe to, you know, gain some sort of home technology and home capability here is to invest in its money markets for technology financing. And so, you know, rather than having an AI Act, why don't we have whatever act for, you know, venture capital or corporate venture capital or technology, you know, markets and technology financing. And so sometimes I'm a bit, you know, swayed by this very, you know, big fascination that policymakers have in Europe to take the latest technological form factor and put acts after it and say, we're going to do something about this, right? So I find this completely strange, and sometimes I just feel that we should, you know, take a step back and think about, okay, what do we want to achieve here? We want to achieve a single market. We want to see some homegrown technology, and this requires, you know, in a cash flow intensive technological domain, this probably requires, you know, more deep and liquid money markets for for the technology. And not to talk about the language problem that Europe has compared to the Anglo-American world. The lemons problem.
No, but first, let me just intervene very briefly on that. In the AI Act, the European Commission in the original draft is actually mentioning that, not using the term the Brussels effect, but this is put in the AI Act that being the first, Europe will then in practice regulate the entire world and influence other part of the world to regulate, because Europe done it, right? This is in the draft of the AI Act, which at least to the first, this might be a first. This wasn't in the DMA, this wasn't in the DSA, although they bragged about, the Brussels effect. But indeed, so there is this idea for the single market, but also the idea of being the first to regulate as, a token of competencies. Now on the lemons.
Right. So
the lemons, no problems.
The lemons problem is So remember, I said one of the questions that comes to mind when you're interested in economics is: are we going to see a market failure that we can call monopoly power in the next window of technological evolution in computing? And I think one area in which you may have a market failure, very idiosyncratic or specific to AI, sorry to use academic jargon here, is this idea that there might be too much crap in terms of the AI goods and services that you see on market. So, the easy example is, every time I use ChatGPT, I'm impressed in domains that I don't know nothing about. Every time I use ChatGPT for antitrust or competition policy, which is my field the field where I know most, I'm completely dismayed by the level of error and shortcuts and mistakes that you find there. And George Haeckel of Nobel Prize economist wrote about this. He said, in some markets where it's very hard to, where you have very strong information asymmetries, these markets tend to generate too much production, oversupply of poor quality content. And he used the example of second-hand markets for cars, and he said, in second-hand markets for cars, you see, cars that are completely worn out, and so there's this huge quality problem. So I think you can see that with AI in various types of content that are supplied. So these are things like, of course, of course we saw the Jacques Prévert like poem that but maybe if we had Jacques Prévert here, it would say, this is just awful. This is ridiculous. I would never write something so lame and disgusting.
I thought this was great.
Yeah, I find it great, but I'm not an expert of Jacques Prévert. Yeah, so you have these problems. Content moderation might be one of them as well. And so the question is whether you want to rely on the traditional market regulation mechanism that are oftentimes used when you have a new information technology like copyright and free speech regulation as the sort of baseline, or do you want to adopt specific regulatory mechanism to address this lemons market failure, which might be things like labeling and identification and so on.
Thanks very much. Now on the moats, the regulatory moats.
Yeah.
And again, how to overcome that if possible.
And AI is a good case for this type of approach. I'm always surprised to see companies asking for regulation, or not asking for regulation. Asking for regulation is one thing, asking to be regulated is another. So I'm always surprised when I see companies regulate us. It's strange in itself, but when I see this, my immediate reaction is to think, right, we're doing such a terrible job with our product, they're completely unsafe, we need you to regulate us. It sounds really stupid to me, but often there's a strategy behind that, and a lot of antitrust lawyers will be familiar with this concept of regulatory moats. And what you see at the moment in the US, a bit in Europe as well, with the whole discussion on foundation models, is part of that discussion. If I'm a leading company on the market, AI market, for example, and I manage to get the regulators to put really far-reaching rules that are very difficult to comply with, I might be the only one that has the means to comply with these rules. And thanks to the regulator, I have secured a little market for me and maybe a couple of friends, which will be absolutely impossible for anyone else, no matter the size, but more important than the size is the business model, anybody to penetrate that market. In the context of AI, I mean, it's becoming very obvious, I find, and I find this extremely dangerous because the business model is important, and I think that the big battle of years to come on this one will be between open and very closed business models. Maybe we can talk about that later, but I'm not sure there is a way, and I know we'll talk about that to go against this. There are solutions to make sure that, you know, with the AI Act, for example, we don't create one cozy little market for 1, 2, 3 of the companies that you have mentioned before. So, you know, we have to be careful when we see companies asking to be regulated, I think.
Yeah, and what we see is that OpenAI and Microsoft are asking for regulation in the space. I actually spent a few weeks thinking about this subject, and I was very grateful because there is, thanks to the question, I found something that I liked a lot about the DSA, the Digital Services Act, which is very much different from GDPR. The DSA will actually put more burden on the companies with the most users, right? Which is not something that GDPR would do, and actually we know now, from empirical data, that the day GDPR entered into force, 1/3 of the apps disappeared from the stores because they could not comply. And I'm wondering sometimes if we could do something similar for the AI Act, where you would say, well, the most users, the more you have to comply with certain regulations, which seems to be a way to actually distribute proportionally regulations. So what would you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea. It's making its way in Brussels at the moment, a DSA type of approach. Some are talking about regulating only what they call systemic models. I'm sure you're familiar with the expression. Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. The whole question is, though, again, like we've had in the DSA and DMA, how do you define, what criteria do you use to look at, to characterize a systemic model, whatever name you want to use it? It's difficult because in the various academic papers I've seen on the topic, many of them had criteria which could apply to an open source developer or very small a foundation model company. So it's very difficult. I would be more in favor of using, well, you might say it's easy to say for a B2B company, but I would be more in favor of looking at, indeed, the B2C market, because, you know, in the context of AI legislation, we've always pushed for what we call precision regulation, which is regulating AI at the point of risk, where it touches a human, and then you have a potential risk. So I see a lot more chance of risks being unmitigated or uncontrolled in the consumer-facing generative systems, for example. So to me, DSA-like criteria with a certain number of millions of end users would be the way to go about this.
Are you trying to capture the regulators in the room by any chance right now?
Yeah, regulate them.
All right, let's move on to part 2 of the discussion. Now we will focus on Europe. But before we talk about regulations, which we love as lawyers, I want to talk about here again the dynamics and what is happening within Europe. And the question here, I guess, will be whether or not Europe is indeed in a promising situation. I've seen many reports coming on the subject. We hear that France is doing well, and Berlin and Dublin and other cities, but it's hard to get a sense of whether or not indeed we could raise that competition and actually arrive in a good position compared to the US. There is an annual report, you may have seen that, put out by the HAI at Stanford University, an initiative centered on AI. And every year they will actually put out, when it comes to AI, how many patents, which part of the world, which type of patent. You see that Europe is actually not doing too bad when compared to the US. But Nico, what is your take on that? Where do we stand? Not, again, looking at regulation, but more dynamics of Europe in general.
Yeah, that's not an easy question. I mean, I'm not, I'm not in industry, I'm not in VC, I'm not in any of these fancy, exotic, activities. From a university, it's very hard to say where we are. From a social science university, it's very hard to say. Now, one thing that I witnessed as a European citizen, just like you, and a French citizen, a European citizen, and Jean-Marc, is I see every technological discontinuity in computer industries happen without the presence of any major European player. And that is a cause of concern as a citizen. You see the Google, the Facebook, the Meta, now the OpenAI, the NVIDIA, and none of that activity is intrinsically tied to the European territory. So I'm not nostalgic of factories with smoke on European territory, but I sense that we owe to the European population a sense of promising a better future that is not necessarily 10,000s of kilometers away from them, right? Every citizen is in a way a shareholder of its economic system. We pay taxes and we try to think about the jobs of our children. So I, as a citizen and father, I'm very sad that every piece of news that I comment upon in the digital space involves non-European stakeholders as the major source of attention. All right, so that's just a sort of very personal remark. Now, when I think about this as a lawyer, I have witnessed in the legal academia and in the legal policy-making structure in Brussels a lot of pushback on one idea. So there is this idea, so the European policymakers and the legal academia has predominantly tried to attack something like this idea that regulation kills innovation. And I think it's fair to say that regulation doesn't undermine innovation. There's many walks of life in which regulation helps or assists or provides the legal certainty needed for innovation to happen. But I think what we are seeing is sort of going overboard and actually thinking that regulation is the main comparative advantage that Europe has to trigger innovation. And I think this jump from regulation doesn't undermine innovation to regulation is needed to create innovation is, I think, one leap too far. I can't really think of any innovation created by regulation, except maybe the sort of diesel, whatever emission-reducing scam that car manufacturers were using to bypass the strict emission controls in. So, and that was done by under a cartel, actually. So, I think Europeans should really rethink, European lawyers should really rethink this idea about the relationship between regulation and innovation, and maybe not go the other way, thinking that regulation enables innovation. Michael Porter wrote about this, actually, but maybe this is the Michael Porter that should not really be considered as much as the 5 forces and competitive advantage.
So in the spirit of squeezing my two speakers here, I will again go to you, Nicolas. Let's forget for just another minute about the AI Act. How would you regulate, let's say you have to do something for political reasons. You have to come up with a piece of regulation. Let's take that as a given. How would you approach the subject if you were at the European Parliament? Which kind of principles would you promote? Is there anything that you think would be a good lighthouse?
Yeah, so thanks. France used to have presidents and kings, so there's one person deciding for everyone, and so you're asking me the French king president question. Okay, so how would I do this? I think we have a fair. Jean-Marc was talking about precision regulation. When it comes to the abstract conceptual problems that AI creates, we have a fairly good understanding of the issues that are challenging. This black box input-output issue, the hallucination problem, and this lemons issue that the sort of quality averages on a sort of middle standard, which is not really great, right? So everyone's going to go to ChatGPT for information about Jacques Prévert, right? Okay, that's sort of. And so I would start from there and say, okay, we have the black box, the hallucination, and the lemons problem, which are idiosyncratic failures in AI markets. What can we do about this? What are the right remedies to do this? Rather than declare a Ground AI Act supposed to, show the light to the rest of the world. I mean, that's, I think, is completely wrong-headed in my view.
Now, to be fair, Jean-Marc, same question.
Actually, I would keep some of the principles that are behind the AI Act, because the architecture of it is quite good. Let's have something technology neutral. Let's have something risk-based. And let's make sure that every important player in the value chain, which is a very complex value chain, is accountable for what they are doing at the moment when they are in charge in the value chain. But there are things I wouldn't do. I wouldn't put, we're talking about this, I wouldn't put product safety and fundamental rights in the same basket. This is going to be a nightmare to enforce if you're the surveillance authorities or in charge of the conformity assessments, for example. That's going to be really hard. I wouldn't have a static list of what's considered a high-risk use. The technology evolves too quickly. You can't have static elements. So, I would keep a lot in the AI Act, but I would be extremely clear on who should do what, when. Maybe not go into so much detail in the requirements that you have for high risk in the AI Act, because this leads to very soon, I think, obsolete requirements. And you know what? I know it's usually not part of a piece of legislation, but I would do at the same time something separate about skilling and giving money to the national regulators, all these agencies that are going to be first in line to regulate AI when the AI Act is passed, because that's going to be a big job. And at the moment, I mean, you mentioned it with the competition authorities, but in a lot of countries you have, if you talk to these agencies, people telling you, I have 3 guys here. They don't know anything about AI. They're going to have to control conformity assessment procedures. They'll have to do market surveillance. How are we going to do that?
Nico?
Yeah, I want to second what Jean-Marc just said. So the AI Act treats fundamental rights as ESG-like KPI issues. Like, what's going to happen is what you're seeing today in industries like banking or others, with struggling with ESG, trying to operationalize these ESG requirements. It's going to happen with the AI Act. You're going to have to operationalize human rights assessments. And, there's a good reason why in our legal traditions, human rights disputes were adjudicated before courts, because they involve extremely complicated trade-off solving issues and proportionality assessments. These are not things you put on a scale with numbers and you decide on them as if you were running a sort of actuarial algorithm, right? You don't do this. And so I think the flaw in the AI Act is probably this idea that human rights assessments can be turned into operational KPIs that standard setting organizations and conformity committees and market surveillance authorities can enforce. And the ton of paperwork that is going to fall on the table of legal counsels, in-house counsels, and HR, committees in companies is going to have a huge opportunity cost on business.
So we heard from both of you already what are the drawbacks of the AI Act. Jean-Marc, already you said that maybe the philosophy, the general approach, maybe not too bad, in case it's not clear for you in the room. So what the AI Act is doing, it's telling that you have to, regardless of the type of AI that you are running, and the definition was very broad when it was first introduced. It covered, of course, machine learning, but also expert systems, basically decision trees, right? And logical and statistical systems. Regardless of what you do, the space where you will implement AI is what matters. And Article 5 is telling you, well, there are things you can't do. So facial recognition, depending on the conditions, but we don't want you to do that. Subliminal techniques, you cannot do that. Then you have Article 6 to 9 telling you, well, in those areas, this is high risk. So if you do implement and use AI, then we want you to do this, this, and that. This covers education, health, transportation, and critical infrastructures. You talked about the difficulty to enforce the AI Act. There is one that I love, and I wonder if they will keep that in the final version. It says that as someone designing the AI system, you have to, I quote, remain aware that it may discriminate. And I wonder how, as an enforcer, you can assess whether someone remained aware. Anyway, but this might be fixed. And then you have some other areas where AI is considered to be non-risky, and there, if you want to implement a code of conduct, it's good, you could do it, but you don't have to do it. That's the general philosophy. Now, if we think this is maybe okay, my question, and again, I'm going to ask you to, in the spirit of squeezing you, to be as concrete as possible. How do we improve? So if you have only one proposal, I'm not asking you to reform the entirety of the AI Act, but something very practical, what would it be? And I will start with you, Jean-Marc.
Okay, so, and you know, at this stage, it's the trialogue, so the final negotiation between the three parties. There isn't much you can actually change a lot, so, you know, I want to stay in the real world of what we can actually do. And I would shock you in the sense that I would try to stick with the Commission's risk-based approach. We talked about foundation models, generative systems. There's a whole discussion right now going in every direction on how to regulate ChatGPT and what's a foundation model, or should we talk about general purpose AI? Nobody knows how to define this stuff. It's a specific type of AI technology. Yeah, maybe the one that's really conquering the market at the moment, but this is not technology neutral, and this is not risk-based discussions at the moment. So the thing I would change is this: go back to the focus on where you have risks, and not just think of the latest trend, the latest technology that is making the headlines, and try and regulate that. Because, as you know well, you have a 2-year transition period between the vote and the entry into force, which means something that's been written in 2018-19 is going to enter into force in 2026. That's 7 years.
Different world. Yeah. Now, what's funny is that when it comes to the DMA, another act, if you look at the list of the sectors where you could potentially be a gatekeeper, in which case you are regulated, generative AI is not listed, right? So if you have more than the users required and the turnover or the market cap, if you just operate Gen AI, or at least when it comes to that, you can escape the DMA. And maybe this is why, when it comes to the AI Act, knowing that this was still a draft, they thought, well, maybe, you know, it's time for us to do something about it. But so, going back to you now, Nicolas, a very concrete proposal to put on the table, what would it be to improve the AI Act?
Okay, so there are 3 categories of risk in the AI Act. It's like a sandwich with 3 slices. An acceptable risk and very concrete applications are mentioned, things like manipulating, you know, children and this and that, and law enforcement use of facial recognition and, you know, personalized whatever, targeting and stuff. And then there's the high risk list, which is I'd say 15 to 25% of the applications in the world. And this is the core center of the AI Act. So the second slice is very big. And then there's the low risk stuff, which is subject to very soft mechanisms. So I would keep the unacceptable list and remove all the rest. And I would really think hard about whether we've really made a very comprehensive list of what we treat as unacceptable. When I was in the high-level expert group on AI, we called them red lines. And I think the first thing we wanted to do is have some red lines, right? And there was considerable disagreements in the room about, you know, what should be a red line or not a red line. Can you use AI for, you know, weapons and this and that? And so, but at least it focuses the discussion on, you know, things in which people really believe and in which you can get some sort of agreements. Or if you get disagreements, you can rationalize this. But having this sort of soft, you know, underbelly of very intense and costly regulatory requirements over applications we have no clue what they can be, like foundational models. I mean, the AI Act was very well placed in terms of its timing, and this, maybe here I beg to disagree. I mean, in terms of, okay, we have something in the pipe that's going to deal with this, but, you know, oh gods, we thought about everything but foundational models, right? So the AI Act was well in place and well in time, but just the focus was just really not on where the technology was going, and you know, who knew where the technology would be going. So I would do this. Maybe just a word on the DMA. That's hearsay, so subject to a lot of you know, verifications, but in DG Comp, the Directorate General for Competition at the European Commission, when ChatGPT was launched into market and you know, went like this in terms of adoption, the units working on the DMA asked themselves, oh God, we missed this one. And so we had a list of core platform services that didn't include foundational models. And so in the European Commission, the question became this sort of typical stuff you see in the European Union lawyering circles. How can we bring this within one of the categories? And then the question was like, okay, foundational models, is this cloud? No. Is this a social network? Not really. And then eventually I heard that, you know, if there was a political push to fit generative AI into the DMA, the right basket would be search engine, right? But so, you know, think about this, you know, in terms of an example of a very wooden, very prescriptive, very stuck in time piece of regulation, right? And of course, you know, of course, the people in the Commission will point you to a clause in the DMA which says that the list of core platform services can be updated. Well, you're up for 18 months of long, complex discussions. But maybe that process is you know, too costly, and we don't really have the time to play with, you know, that's legal, whatever, drivel.
And to go back to Article 5, again, Article 5, that gives you the list of what is prohibited. So have a look at it if you're interested. I've been playing with that with some of my students. So if you look at some of the examples, you see that the wording is actually, of course, very interesting. It tells you that you cannot do real-time biometric identification. So then I asked my student, well, what if we delay by 2 seconds? Is it real time? And they said, well, no, it's not real. I mean, it's real time. I was like, okay, then 10 seconds. I mean, at some point, you're going to have to say, well, a minute is not real time anymore, right? So this is going to be where you're going to see litigations for sure. It also says that subliminal techniques are prohibited. And then I thought, well, what about advertisement? You know, if you watch the French Open, I don't know if some of you are doing that. Every 2 games, it goes to advertisements, and you will hear a can opening. Is that a subliminal technique or not, right? So this type of litigation is surely coming. Now, we only have 7 minutes left, and I want to take 5 minutes now for questions, if you have any questions, before I ask you to vote once again, and then I proceed with my surprise questions. Is there any questions you want to ask? Just here, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias from Ericsson, and great intensity in this last session, so thank you for that. One thing that is coming back in my mind, maybe due to illiteracy about this subject, but you refer to regulation in cloud, social platforms, and other platforms. My question is, with regards to generative AI, is there a technological difference that warrants a different regulatory approach just because of the potential outcomes of the technology itself? That, like, let me rephrase it once more. So because it is still moving super fast and holds promises of really sort of the aspect of generating something which is allegedly different from cloud and other things, that is more driving something into a different digital domain, is this a point of difference or not, in your opinion?
Who wants to answer this one?
I'm not sure I quite get the question, to be honest. But of course, it's a very different technology to cloud and all the other technologies that are covered by other pieces of legislation. It's absolutely new, even though you could still see it as a tool making recommendations. But then when you look at how it really works, if you look, yeah, it's very different. So I'm not sure that the current legislative acquis that we have would apply to generative systems. I'm not saying that we need a new legislation for generative systems, but it's a technology on its own, for sure.
Which was one of the struggle with the AI Act, right? It was not an AI system you could design just for health. It could be used for many things. You want to say something as well?
Yeah, I think maybe what Jean-Marc is hinting at is, you know, these are decision-making assistants. And they have this expert veneer that, you know, would allow people to act upon the inputs they get from the output they get from these systems. This can be pretty dangerous in some walks of life, right? There's contexts in which you want a second opinion. You don't want to, you say this in English, a quack, or, you know, something that's, you know, really not really good science or good advice. And so, again, you know, the expectations that users generate when they experience the technology are, you know, advisory in nature, and therefore, these information technologies require a degree of caution in terms of how you signal the outputs, how you label them, and how much you can rely on them to act and behave.
We now move on to vote number 2. I'm going to ask you, again, it's the same link, so you can just refresh the page, or again, scan the QR code, or go to slido.com and enter the hashtag SIP2023. While you vote, I will actually give you the result of the first vote. 33% of you thought the AI Act was overall not so bad or good. 51% thought not so good. And I love this one. 16% of you answered that you are not answering surveys, which is very ironical. Right, let me move on with some surprise question to finish. We only have 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask you to provide me with very short answers, like 30 seconds. Nicolas experienced that already, so I know he's shaking right now. I'll start with you.
Sure.
You are, and that's an easy one, not just a researcher, of course, you're also a teacher.
Yeah.
So my question is, where is AI helpful in the classroom? Are you using it? Do you plan on using it with your students?
Yeah, okay, so there's 2 ways I want to use it, okay? One is you generate outputs from AI. My students are antitrust experts, right? You generate output about standard antitrust questions, and you ask them to correct them. Okay, so correct the AI output on antitrust. 2, I use I use English writing improvements AI software, such as Jenny.ai, for instance, to ask my students who are not native English speakers to improve their wording and their sentences.
All right, thanks a lot. Jean-Marc, different question. Would IBM like to become as dominant in AI as it once was in PC?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, to both of you, which tools are you using, and maybe just one, or which one are, when it comes to generative AIs, that you enjoy the most?
That's a good question.
Nico, do you have one in mind? You mentioned one already, but maybe a second one.
Yeah.
Then I'll go back to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I use Jenny.ai. It's pretty good. It's very, very good. So you can put text there, an email, whatever, and then you have like several menus like simplify, paraphrase, clarify, elaborate, and then you have you can change, calibrate the sort of style. So you can do that casually, academically, professionally, and it returns you some options, and it's always pretty helpful for standard business communication.
Give us one.
Okay, I'll give you 2, one boring and one exciting. First one, I mean, it's a tool that we use in the company, you know. related to anything HR. It works quite well, I have to say. So use that one a lot. The other one, with my football club, we spend a bit of time putting stats. You know, this player did this week, you know, saved 3 goals. This guy made 2 good passes. This guy hasn't showed up. And every month we have a new team that is suggested by the machine to give you 2 teams that are more or less the machine thinks at the same level. It's not too bad. I have to say it's not too bad. I don't. It's one of the members that has it, so I can't remember the name right now, but I can give it to you. It's okay.
Thank you very much. I give you the result, and then I have one final question for each of you. So 36% of you now think that AI Act is overall not so bad. So we improved. So you convinced them that the AI Act is good. 54% that it's not as good as we hoped, and 10% of you answered that you are not answering surveys. Very last question. Jean-Marc, you're French, and so as Bo, I actually asked ChatGPT a question, and the question is whether it's okay to call Prosecco champagne. The answer I got is no, it is not okay to refer as Prosecco as champagne. I agree with that. My question is whether or not you are as snob as I am, and you will also think that it is not okay.
I think it's not okay, and the reason is I've drank Prosecco once in my life.
Never again.
Very final question for you, Nicola. You live in Italy. I asked ChatGPT whether pineapple pizza should be legal. The answer I got, and I disagree with the answer, is this. In most countries, there is no law specifically regulating the toppings that can be put on top of a pizza. If you do not like pineapple pizza, you can simply choose not to order it that way. I think it should be prohibited. What is your take?
You know, in Italy, even if it's not prohibited by the law, some people will take care of prohibition. So.
All right. Well.
By the way, that's why the Italian government shut down ChatGPT.
The pineapple one.
Because of that question.
Huh.
It's really happened.
It's actually worth now trying, now that they reinstated ChatGPT. Please join me in applauding the 2 speakers on the panel.
Thank you.